So what you see here right now on my palette is 3 primary colors. A lot of us in public school learn about primary colors pretty early on, but over the years I realized not everybody does. So occasionally this is kind of new information. These 3 pigments, ultramarine blue, cadmium red light, and cadmium yellow medium, I picked those fairly specifically because if you were only going to have 3 primary colors of paint to work with, these would be the ones that I would choose. I'm glad to say that we're not only limited to these, and that eventually I recommend that you also get a magenta or a crimson, maybe like a cerulean blue, and a benzimidazolone yellow. I think it's important to talk about that a little bit because if you go to the art store, you see 120 different colors to choose from, and about 100 of those are to get you to spend extra money. Some of the colors are really valuable and they have very specific pigments, like cerulean blue and ultramarine blue are very different in how they mix out. And so you won't be able to get every color that you want with just these 3, but I feel like you get the best range with those. And so this is a very good starting point. And then as you paint, it won't be too long before you want to branch off and get some other pigments. For me as a painter, I usually paint with choices of 3 different reds, 3 different yellows, and 3 different blues. That would be overwhelming if I tried to show you that all today and explain it all. So we're going to keep it a little simpler in this moment. You would struggle, I think, fairly soon if you only had these 3 colors. So if you could only buy 5 colors, I would recommend titanium white and burnt umber, because you by now have picked up that I encourage you to mix a dark color or a black color with burnt umber and ultramarine blue. White helps make things lighter. These 2 colors mixed together makes things darker, and I'll talk more and I'll actually demo that today. One of the reasons that I choose the cadmium pigments instead of the crimson or benzimidazolone light or Hansa yellow light is because cadmium pigments are really strong, and you kind of need that so that your yellow doesn't disappear, and so your red brightens up your palette. It's not the end of the world if you don't have them. You can still paint. Or if you accidentally bought a hue, which is hue is a confusing term because sometimes even with golden brand paint, you'll see it'll say cadmium yellow medium hue. And in that case, hue means cheap paint or student grade or academy. And a lot of you might think, well, I'm a student, I should just use cheap paint. The thing is that when you start mixing and you start your color mixing, they don't actually work very well. So then you feel bad about yourself because you're like, why am I not a better painter? And so I kind of try to save you that grief by encouraging you, if you're able to actually just try to avoid buying hues or academy grade paint. You go to all the trouble to try to learn and take a class. It's worth it if you can afford to buy the little bit more expensive paint. What's the most important things for you to all to know today? So we're going to put the burnt umber and the white off to the side. If you're looking sort of for a quick way to start your color mixing, what I recommend is a triangle. red. Actually, I'm going to write the titles on here. I have students or painters that have worked with me that say, well, I'm not organized. I don't do my palette like that. And to be honest, neither do I, or I never did in the past. But as a teacher, I do it this way so that you all can see what I'm talking about. So if at the end of the day, your palette looks like a hot mess, I think that's kind of to be expected. Art's not supposed to be neat and perfect. It can be, like that might be how it comes out for you, but it doesn't have to be. So you're not failing if at the end of this lesson, your palette looks really scattered. But if I just set it up that way, I think that could be confusing for you all. So I try to break it down: cadmium, yellow, medium, like this. So it's easier for you to understand. And frankly, it's made me understand better too. So these are all primary colors, the first colors. Then what you mix with those is secondary colors. Most of you are like, I know all this already, but it doesn't hurt to have a refresher. So, you know, half and half, red and yellow makes orange. Now, red is stronger than yellow. So what we have there is a very red orange. So instead, I'm going to pull more yellow over. To get a more orange. We could make a yellow orange right here. When you hear these words, primary, red, blue, yellow, secondary is orange, purple, green. Tertiary is red, orange, yellow, orange. Like tertiary just means those extra colors in between. I won't talk a ton about tertiary colors, but there's something I think you almost automatically do when you're mixing paint, because you know, not everything you look at falls right in the middle of the oranges or right in the middle of your purple. Now, one thing to be aware of when you mix cadmium blue, cadmium blue, ultramarine blue with cadmium red, you don't really get a bright purple. You get something that looks like a dying eggplant. And that's actually a very useful color to have. But if you are painting something like an orchid, or, you know, somebody wearing a purple gown, or, you know, purple's really what you're looking for. In order to get that kind of true violet, you have to use a crimson when you mix. Today we're using Cad Red Light, which is kind of an orange red. And ultramarine blue. So the purple we get is on the brown side. It's because of this sort of orange quality of the Cad Red Light. And you might think, well, then why don't you use Napathol Red Light or, you know, crimson? This is actually more naturally occurring. That organic purple is more what I run into when I'm painting still life. So I feel like it's a better base for this primary lesson. I'm gonna put a little more Cad yellow out because I need it. And here we go with our green. I think with ultramarine blue and cadmium yellow that we get a very forest green. A lot of house plants are this color. This color is not the easiest. For example, if you're describing eucalyptus leaves, or it kind of works for some jade plants, but some succulents have that more dusky gray look. And so then cerulean blue is a better option as a pigment for that baseline. But with, just hitting the basics, if you were painting a forest, that's a pretty good green there. So we've got our primaries, red, blue, yellow, secondaries, orange, purple, green. And then, for example, here would be the tertiary for blue, green. So when you're doing your palette mixing, because you did your underpainting, let's think back to our previous lessons. You made your underpainting, and now you're mixing your color palette to paint over top. Maybe you're painting a landscape or a forest scene. These greens are all very helpful then. Look, I have to add quite a lot of yellow to make this look different. But perhaps you don't really see any orange in that scene, so you might not go to the trouble to mix of many varieties of different oranges. Let's make this look a little cleaner, because this isn't it. We're taking it further. Actually, we'll do this step. Primary red, orange. Cleaning my palette knife in between. Yellow. Going for that middle green. Ultramarine blue. And purple brown. So the next thing I want you to think about is shading and tinting. So shading, just going to mix this right on my paper. Putting out some burnt umber. And a little bit of ultramarine blue. To my eye, I can see that's leaning a little bit on the blue side. That's okay. That's gonna work. Shade. And then over here on the other side, let's think about tinting. Tint. If you're looking for a homework assignment, what I would love for you to do is take each of the paint colors that you have at home and make a tint scale. So take those colors and see what they look like when you add white to them. What happens if you add a lot of white? What happens if you add a little bit of white? So it really changes how that color looks. And then I don't think quite as important is the shading, because once I add dark, colors all start looking more similar. Whereas once I add tints, I see a vast difference. But it is good to understand what happens as you shade your colors. Just a little bit of black in there really didn't make a difference. So now I'm trying a little more. If I was painting an object that had this color of purple, it would be important for me to understand how to make it lighter or how to make it darker. So like right here, let's do our ultramarine blue tints. I'm going to speed this process up because I got a lot of stuff to show you today. So tinting lighter. Tinting lighter. Boy, that white didn't make a dent in the yellow. We'll do a lot of white. I also, somewhere along the line, picked up a small amount of red. Must have been towards the back of my palette knife or on the cloth that I keep cleaning my palette knife off on. Let's just smooth this out so you can really see it. Same with this blue. I know a lot of time when I try to have you all make color cards, we tend to make them kind of small. You can see these swatches are very big, and I kind of encourage you, if you can, to use a bigger piece of paper, because I can see that way better than when I make a little square that's 1 by 1 inch. You know, for me, the values read much better when I give myself a little more room. Let's see if my red is able to pink up there for me. Yeah, so there's my tints. Let's try mixing a little dark in there. There's my shade. My ultramarine blue is quickly drying up on me. It's also a darker color, so you don't see as big of a difference when we shade the purple and blue as when we come over here and try shading the orange. Or shading yellow. Notice how the orange and the yellow go kind of green with that blue-black mixture. That's very normal, and can be useful thing to know, depending on what you're painting. We'll kind of describe that more, go more into it in the future. I'm not going to get into it today too much. So here's green shade. Let's say that you were painting this lemon. Having, I mean, yeah, you're like, it's a lemon. I know that I'm going to use yellow, but having made a color card or some kind of physical representation in your studio of how your colors act, like you might think yellow lemons are yellow and I keep adding white and it's going to be yellow and white. But when you see the physical representation here, you realize, oh, if I shade, and also one side of this lemon is greener than the other, just a little bit. I think you can see that. But yes, you can get a lot of this lemon that you need with these. You also might end up using a little bit of this shaded orange too, like across some of the edges. And then pulling it lighter right here in the center. I'm not sure how this is going to look on Zoom. I also brought this apple, which is similar in color to the lemon. And sometimes the computer screen doesn't. Of course, I've got paint on the lemon now. Doesn't show the differences that I can see in life with my eye, but I am able to see that this is warmer than the lemon. So I know that I would be kind of coming over here. And honestly, if I was painting this apple, and I think that I'm going to try to demo that before we end class, I would probably start with a base of some of this purple, let it dry, and then pull these really warm colors over top. That seems counterintuitive. That is not how we think. We think from the surface. We try to copy the surface. But if you want to build form in things that feel believable, usually you need to kind of do a contrary or like a color that doesn't necessarily make sense underneath because it's in there. It's not all just high chroma. So when I talk about chroma, so you hear words in color theory, like, let's get my pen out here. Hue, chroma. You also hear words like tint. We'll just write it here in the list too. And shade. I think by now, and you probably already knew, that tint means making things lighter and shade means darker. But for me, hue and chroma have always been really confusing words. So one of the confusing things about hue is that in the paint industry, it gets used as a description for cheap paint. But the word hue is actually just means color. The hue of red, the hue of orange, the hue of yellow. It's not special. You should just be able to use that word interchangeably. The hue of blue, the hue of purple, color of purple, the color of blue. So that one's almost so simple that you can kind of forget about it. You're not trying to do anything to the color to make it a hue. Now, chroma, I think, is the one that is the most difficult to understand, but it's actually pretty simple. These colors are very high chroma. Right out of the tube paint is generally high chroma. So orange and yellow and red and blue are high chroma colors. When you tint it, you reduce the chroma. When you shade it, you reduce the chroma. Anything that kind of pulls it away from that purest, brightest form is lowering the chroma. And the reason, I don't know, it's kind of important to understand that is that a lot of people, when they're learning to paint, they mix their colors like this, and you're really outside of, on the high end of chroma, and not everything in life is like that. My hand is not very high in chroma. Like you look at my hand and sweater, and they are not as bright as everything else you see on this page, because to mix the color of my hand, we would have to go between this blue and orange. You know, you don't just add orange to white to get European skin color. Like it's not that simple, or red to white to get that pink. So that's when complementary mixing comes in. So the complement is something that you get when you mix opposites on the color wheel. So does anybody have any questions for me at this point? I'm trying to break this down slowly so it makes a little bit of sense. Okay, we're just powering along. The most important thing that I need you to understand about complements, and the reason I want you to understand it is because it's going to make painting easier for you. And that is the whole point. I don't really care about rules and how things work that much unless it makes my life easier. And if you take my classes over the long term, and some of you have been in many of them, you'll know, we're not going to do this today, but I am going to show you. I talk a lot about complementary mixing. This is a complementary palette of blue to orange. This one is red to green. This one is yellow to purple. And these are all mixed with these primary colors that I was showing you today. The point of this exercise is that it gives you a lot more range than just adding dark or just adding light. Let's look specifically at this red to green. So if you mix red with green, what you get in the middle is brown. These colors are so useful because when you pull them out to tints, This is where a lot of what we're looking at and what we're trying to imitate with paint is over here. But what I really want you to start thinking about today is look at the red. If you want to shade your red or make your red slightly darker, like where the shadow is, or slightly less bright, slightly less high in chroma, you add the opposite of green. We generally think when we want things to be shadowed or not as bright that we add black. The thing about adding black is it makes a lot of the objects that we're painting turn gray, which can be useful. Sometimes they should turn gray, but sometimes it's not that you want it to be grayer, you just want to knock down the chroma. So this red is very high in chroma, and as we pull it toward the complement, the chroma lowers. Brown here in the center this is a very low in chroma. This green, high chroma out here on the edge. It's a secondary color, but it feels very primary in its brightness. And then as you add red to it, it dulls out. The thing is, if we were painting a forest scene, yes, some of the leaves would look like this, but a lot of the leaves look like this. And what you see is an intermixing. So if you're looking at, let's try it with the apple. If you're looking at an apple and you painted your underpainting, you have the form, you have the base down, and then you mix up some yellow and you're like, well, it's yellow, that's it. Or you maybe take some burnt umber or some brown. What I would suggest to consider is taking some of your yellow and adding a very small amount of what is opposite on the color wheel. I might have pulled too much up. So I'm putting a little bit of this back because better to start with less and add more than to be like, oh, I added too much and this went brown too fast. And I'm going to put another step of even a little more brown. If all you learned today in this lesson is that adding a complement can help you with your painting, that would be great. I think a lot of you already knew much of what I was building up here, but this tends to be the hardest thing for us to get our heads around. If you need to deepen that color, you need to knock off that candy-like intensity, try adding the complement. That doesn't mean that I don't need the tints to paint this apple or the shades, but I also need the complement. And I think I see a little red in there too. So that means that on my palette, I'll be coming over here and making maybe a little bit of a red yellow color. So we're at 10:38, and what I'm going to do quickly is just paint this apple. And I actually think I'm going to cut it in half so that we can see the white of it too. One of my thoughts about this lesson is like, if I just told you to paint an apple and you didn't have a lot of experience with painting, or this yellow apple, you would probably put some yellow paint out. Maybe you'd go as far as putting some brown or green paint out and trying to mix that color to match. But then, and if I said, well, cut it in half and paint the center, you would probably make some white and try to add yellow to it and get it as close as you could. And that's how a lot of us paint. But as we start moving into color mixing, I'm just trying to give you the opportunity to have more range. So the center of this apple is actually fairly yellow too, but it's not this yellow. You can't just add white to this yellow. It's actually browning as I'm speaking. I better talk faster. Let's try this color right here. We'll put it over here. Because what I think needs to happen is this needs to go much whiter and lighter to get there. And I have run out of white paint. I always buy the most white, titanium white, because that is the one that I use the most of. So I'm grabbing quite a bit of it off my palette now. Let's just keep going with this. See if this is going to be the right color for my interior of my apple. Sometimes I make my guesses about this and I'm wrong. A lot of the times at this point, I'm pretty on point. I have a good idea. So this is kind of too blue-gray or maybe a little too white. But as I'm looking at it, this has a bit of a green. So I'm going to try taking a little green off of here and adding it to see if that's the right quality of warmth. I see that. I think that works, but I don't think that's the only color for the interior of my apple. So I leave that mixed up to use. And then I'm like, well, what happens if I add white to this? Now, when I'm actually painting, I'm not slowly breaking this down and thinking about all of it. I'm aware of it. And sometimes when I get stuck with a color, I jump off to the side and really do try to work it out like this. But what happens over time as you practice and consider and contemplate, it just starts becoming part of your muscle memory and understanding. So it changes the way you paint. I think this is nice, but it could go a little lighter. I'm tempted to put paint right on this apple, but I also sort of want to eat it. So I don't think that I'm going to just smear the paint on there. Depending what I'm looking at, I do that. So I think between this color, and white, that I would be able to address this apple. So very quickly, I'm going to do an underpainting. Sorry, my paper's across the studio. Make an underpainting of this apple. Halves. Let's see if you can see it. You're looking at it from a different angle than me, but I'm seeing it a little more from a half view like this. And actually, instead of black, I'm going to start with that mixture, that primary mixture that I was using of ultramarine blue and cadmium red. You don't always, well, you know, the last few lessons I've been talking about underpaintings, and I've only been addressing them with the mixture of burnt umber and ultramarine blue. You all know that one by heart by now, but that doesn't mean you always have to start your underpaintings with those colors. I just like to start getting you to practice with that really dark first. And then, you know, if you're not coming back to class and you're kind of working on your own, that's great. I want you to practice, you know, and try playing around with different types of underpainting colors. Try just burnt umber or just burnt sienna. I've been using kind of this pointy round brush. Now I'm just taking this big soft flat brush and kind of, I want to knock back my whites a little bit. These washes are, it's acting more like a watercolor. Now, mostly well, I don't really want to move that up while I'm looking at it. I get confused sometimes while I'm talking to you all. I'd like you to be able to see my palette at the same time. So I'm trying to figure out, well, let's just do it like this. We're back to that and meet that original palette that I was looking at. And I probably need a little more white paint on here. So I have my yellow. I want to add some of this purple, maybe not that much, to knock down the intensity. What I really got is kind of a muddy gold color there. So now I'm going to take more of my yellow. And let's put more of that out too. Right here, we got yellow right out of the tube. I think this green is going to be helpful for right here where the stem area is. I might end up using a little of this orange. And we have this. Yeah, I'm going to carry forward with that. We'll focus on this one on the right here so you can just get a sense of what I'm doing. I'm going to keep working with this soft flat brush. Apparently this is a messy day. Look at my hands. I'm not just in the neat and clean zone. I'm even going to take a little bit of this purple and wash it across this area, around the edges a bit. I'm not positive that's going to work out for me, but I'm willing to give it a try. And so, you know, if you're not mixing a full palette where you're taking all your complementary values and pulling tints into them and shades, then sometimes I use my brush a little bit because I'm like, And this is the way most of us, learn to paint. I'm not going right for that yellow chroma right out of the tube. I'm going for the yellow that's been slightly knocked off its brightness with the complement. Yellow here, purple across the color wheel. And that might not be the right color as I'm putting it on here, but I'm sure going to give it a try. It's okay if you start painting on your painting and you're like, nope, that's not what I wanted, but it's close. Sometimes you just got to get some color on there. Now, what I see as I'm looking at this apple is also a green ring around the center. I could keep using this brush, but I'm going to pull in my second brush, holding this one in my left hand. And actually, this is the yellow-green, the tertiary. And I'm just coming in here and putting a few hints of it where I can see it. And maybe pull a little more of the brighter yellow right in around that stem area. Now, I had mixed those whites on my other palette on my big piece of paper, but now I'm taking the yellow green that was in my brush and mixing it into my white paint here. I just want that off white yellow tone. And so here I tried putting it on the paper, it wasn't dark enough. So I'm mixing it into this complementary brownish yellow mixture. The flesh of the apple that I'm painting in this moment is a little bit darker in value than it needs to be, but I'd rather get that in there so it feels like it has form and it's solid. And then I can pull a lighter tone over top. So this right here, it's whiter. Right here, it's whiter. And that white right out of the tube feels a little cold to me. So coming back over here to my primary yellow and mixing a bit of that in here. My line is fuller through here than I copied it or painted it. So this could be fuller. Across, so often I make my underpainting, I put a layer of color over top, and I realize I lost details in the process, or I see something that I didn't describe. So the stem of the apple and the way it comes down here, I didn't do any lines to describe that. So now I'm coming in with a fairly pointy brush and I'm drawing in that little stem area. And I'm coming up here and I can see that stem also. While that's, I can see some lines across here too. While that's drying, I'll just jump over here and try painting this other half of the apple. I'll tell you about painting halves of fruit that I almost never feel like I can get my two halves to match. I'm just jumping in here and using the colors that I had shown you before. Pulling a little of that yellow green in here. Some of that across here. And then that complementary mixture of yellow and purple for this apple center color. Coming in darker than it needs to be. There's a little water in here, and you can see how the transparency of the underpainting showing through is helpful, I think. Now I'm pulling a little bit of lighter tone. This is just basically titanium white, wet on wet. So while these colors are drying, well, one, I think this could go a little lighter too. I want that break between the skin of the apple and the flesh to be a fairly strong point. And I feel like now I'm pulling in, so this paint that I have on my brush right here is basically cadmium yellow right out of the tube. Now I'm pulling in that high chroma right across here. It's not showing up because yellow is fairly transparent. So I'm taking some of that high chroma yellow and white tint and trying that. I think right at this point, my paint is so wet that I'm gonna have to wait for it to dry so that I can really try to pull that on top. But I have all this background color that's really just the tabletop color. This, which is very messy with paint, but wood tone. So I don't know, my guess is that's orange with a little bit of ultramarine blue in it. Complements blue and orange. And then let's tint it down to see how close I got. It's getting there, you know. It's a little bit too much on the orange side. But first, I want to get closer with my values. So I'm doing this with my brush. I usually teach you all color mixing with your palette knife, and I want to encourage you to use your palette knife. But sometimes when I'm in the thick of it and I'm painting and I realize I need to make an extra color that I hadn't, then I jump in with my brush and go that direction. Just holding it up. It's actually darker than I'm giving it credit for. So now I'm like, what happens over here? This is a little on the bluer side. That's closer. I wouldn't have guessed that with my eye. So just let's come in here. See how it looks against the apple. I'm gonna have to put some shadows in here too. What had happened actually when I was painting is that I had the apples up against my paper. So cleaning out my brush to try to actually do this. The white of the paper was much closer to titanium white. So this line where the apple was sitting was just basically white paper. There's paint in my brush, so it's not coming out quite white. That's okay, because this is a first layer. I'm gonna get to come back in over top of it. But this mixture here, was bluer in shadow. Could even go a little darker. Sometimes you don't get your imitation perfect. And I recommend just don't overthink it. Just keep trying to move forward. If you put the wrong color on there, in 20 minutes, you're going to be able to cover it up and try again. Also, you don't always have to mix to get a perfect match, but I do understand how frustrating it is to want to match something and not know how, which is why I think color mixing lessons are good and useful for you all. Now, I think it would really help me if I managed to get some whiter paint right here in the front. I could keep painting on this apple, but I think for the next few minutes, just for like 3 or 4 more minutes, I'm going to focus on this one. One thing, I'm over here on my palette. I'm back at my not high chroma yellow, my slightly knocked down complementary yellow. And I see an edge on this apple from the skin. So I'm putting that in there. And then I'm also coming back in here and kind of cleaning up that edge too a bit. This area in here has an interesting brightness to it. So I'm trying yellow right out of the tube to see how that looks as I come across. This is an opal apple and they tend to be kind of yellow in the center. And then pulling it in a little bit too across here. Because yellow is very transparent, a lot of the white is showing through from underneath. And now I'm over here at this yellow green again. And I'm adding some of my water to it. And pulling a little bit of that down into here. I like this yellow I added, but I think it's a bit much. So then I'm kind of back over here at this creamy color and playing with pulling a little bit of that back in. It's a little colder than I thought it was going to be. Must have not had as much yellow mixed in there. Squinting at this color as I'm looking at my actual apple, I think it could be a little warmer. And I have really, going back and forth with that complementary yellow range that I did through here. So now I'm going to try just warming a bit of that up with some orange. especially for this area down here in shadow. And then I feel like I could strengthen that yellow right there. Maybe a little yellow green. So I don't think this painting's done, but I think it gives you an idea of what to play around with. Kind of softening some of these shadow breaks. You all tend to be a quieter group, but I am going to open it up for questions if anybody has any questions right now. Especially this being the last class, you can really ask me anything. Doesn't have to be related to what we just talked about. Oh, I got paint all over my computer.
Jolyn, I have a question. Can you go over the differences in brushes and when you prefer using one over the other? Thank you.
Sure. Let's go back to my viewpoint, replace pin. Let's do it like this. And get a white sheet of paper underneath so you can actually see what I'm showing you. So I don't know what's going to happen when I open this up, but this is my messy brush pack. We're going to pull some of these out that I think you should know about. And then I'll explain why. One thing I want to suggest is, or say, is that you shouldn't have to spend a lot of money on your brushes. Unless you're like a more realistic or classically trained painter and you're trying to go for hyper realism, there is a point where it makes sense to spend more to get very finely tuned brushes that are going to help you get that like exactness that you need. The type of painting that I teach gives you a lot of leeway. And I try to, if you're trying to paint more gesturally or in an expressive way, I'm an expressive painter and I use my brushes expressively. I'm not as much on trying to get that tiny little mark or each little point of a feather on a wood duck's tail, which I have done because I studied animal illustration. But once I learned how to do it, I didn't want to do it anymore. So I kind of branched out. Some of my favorite brushes for acrylic and oil painting are bristle brushes. I like them because they're springy. I don't often use them at the very end of a painting because I tend to move more towards something that gives me a point, like this brush. But when I'm starting a painting, especially if it's a little bit bigger, these, I feel like there's something about the natural bristle that the paint wants to stick to the paper instead of this. And I think it's because there's natural oils in the hog bristle. Whereas this is kind of, I wish I had actually a newer white sable, but I don't, because I use all my brushes. This was a white sable that's now tinted with paint pigments. I also like white sable because it gives me a lot of control. This is called a Taklon flat. But when I'm painting like this, more of the paint wants to stay in the brush. So there is a difference. And what I really like is having both, like the softer sable and the more bristly bristle. So as far as like the 3 types of brush hair that I usually work with are the hog bristle, called Bristle Brushes, the white sable, and then when you see brushes that just have this brown hair, those are not, this is not real hair. This is synthetic too. It's pretend sable because, back in the day when they started making brushes, they made them out of animal tails, like a mongoose or ermine. Like the hair, that would be very expensive and nobody needs a brush like that. You can probably find one in an art store for like $200. But what I recommend, so this one, this Taklon flat, I get from Amazon and it's probably like $7. I would buy it in an art store, but I haven't been able to find this specific brush in an art store in Portland. I'm not a big fan of buying a bunch of things from Amazon, but I will do it if it's what I have to do in order to get something specific. What you want to remember, I'm going to write these down so that you can actually see it. Forgive me as I look for a piece of paper. Here we go. This is good. I bought this tablet for somebody for Christmas and it came bent in the mail a little bit. So now I just kept it for myself. You want to think about, so white sable, I like Taklon flat. That is not a brand, that is a type of brush. So if you went to the art store and you were like, I want to spend $5 to $10 on a decent white sable brush, then look for Taklon flat. This is a size number 1. And if you see me doing contour, I often use this brush for the contour. If you see me painting gesturally, you're going to see me using a bristle brush almost always. So bristle brushes, you can buy individually, but I tend to buy them in packs. And Utrecht, the brand, Utrecht Interlock. I think Interlock is the description. These last the longest. What I've been doing is going, I mean, you see these brushes right here, but I have more than 100 other ones that I use for oil painting or acrylic painting. These are just the ones that I have for my teaching. I try to keep handy. So this one is actually a Princeton brush, and you can see that it's sort of splayed a little bit. It doesn't have the same interlocking that I'm describing here. The Utrecht Interlocked bristle brushes, you can get them from Blick. They come in a pack of maybe 5. and different sizes. I would get a pack of those, depending if they're on sale or not. They're $40 to $60 for 5 brushes. But if you wash them out well, they will last you for years. The bristle brushes have the most longevity. They're the toughest. And I definitely recommend getting a pack of those. These brown sable brushes that you see, or like this green handled one, these come in real value packs at most art stores. Real value assorted. They are essentially craft brushes. They're a little better than a craft brush. They call them paint brushes. They don't last so long. They're cheap. It's maybe $10 for a pack of 5 to 10. And I have a lot of these because I tend to use them to scrub into the painting or for doing finer detail at the end. I'm not a real specific detail painter, so I don't spend, $15 or $20 on one tiny brush to get that little tiny mark. I tend to buy these packs. They last me anywhere from, each brush lasts me anywhere from 6 weeks to a year, depending on how much I'm destroying it. But what I have is like a lot of little cheap brushes in addition to the ones that I spend a little more money on. That's like brand, real value, Utrecht. Taklon's type. The Taklon brush I have is Connoisseur. Email me if you want the link of how to get it. The other thing to know about brushes is shape and size. So flat brushes have a ferrule. The ferrule is that metal piece that attaches the bristles to the handle. And one, don't let them soak in water because the ferrules will rot and they'll fall apart faster and the brush won't last as long. But a flat brush is kind of the most common, I think, maybe besides a round. They have longer bristles. One way is skinny, one way is fat. What I like about a flat brush and why I recommend having them is they hold more paint. So you get a longer line without breaking in between. Bright, this is why I pulled my pack out, because I figured that I wouldn't necessarily have what I needed right there. Let's see if I can find a bright. For some reason, brights are my favorite brush, and I tend to not be able to find them as easily. This is probably, yep, it officially says it's a bright on the handle. The difference between a flat brush and a bright is that the brights don't have as long of bristles. What I love about brights is that they're good for adding small strokes of paint. And I don't think I'm going to use the bright brush to start my painting. I want to do my underpainting. I want to get a lot of paint out there all over this base canvas. Instead, I think I'm not going to grab that bright because this doesn't hold as much paint. I think about brights for middle areas of value and for finishing. Another favorite brush I have. Sorry, I'm going off about brushes here, everybody, but I think it's really useful to know, so, or curious at least. The filbert is my favorite. Filberts are curved. They're really a round brush pressed flat. So you, once again, you get the skinny line and you get the fat line. They come in all different shapes and sizes. I mean, you can get sable filberts, but mostly I think of getting a filbert and a bristle brush. Big difference between a filbert and a flat is when you're filling in areas of paint. With the flat brush, there's this squaring off, and sometimes you get this extra drag across there, or you just don't have quite as much control. The curve on that filbert makes it easier to fill in space, and also slightly easier, just basically takes the turns better. I don't usually buy round bristle brushes. I buy filberts. I buy round sable brushes because they have the most pointy little ends, and I like using those to make details. So what I found with bristle brushes is that the rounds tend to splay a lot and they fall apart kind of fast. So sometimes they just come in a pack. This is a round bristle brush. You see how it's kind of fluffy. I don't really like that. So I tend to buy, for these cheaper brushes, these pointy rounds because they just have a little more control. Does that help, Kim?
Massively so. Thank you so much, Jolyn.
Yeah, no problem. Any other questions? Well, thanks everybody for being here today. If you end up, I don't feel like this, I feel like there was a ton of information in this lesson, but maybe it was a little boring, but I think that's par for the course sometimes when you're trying to get the nuts and bolts of something down. So if during the next month you plan to practice on your own, let me know because I have videos. Oh, thank you, Jody. I have videos and like what would be your next step? Demos recorded, like I recorded this lesson from last year's classes. So I'd be happy to email those to you or get you the Discord link so you can look them up yourself. And you're welcome to continue looking in on Discord even when you're not in this class anymore. I'm not proprietary about things that I record. I just am kind of putting the library out there for you all to use. You don't have to pay me to look at things that I already made. I post them to YouTube, but if there's a lot of classroom content or like critique interaction, I make those links private. So you can find those on Discord. Or you can ask me for them, but I wouldn't necessarily, if we were looking at your art and we were talking about it, you're not going to see yourself on YouTube. So yeah, that's kind of where things are at. I guess I can stop recording this now.